It is a tragedy for people like myself, brought up and living through a period of unrest and violence which all national struggles produce, to explain actions which then seemed necessary and right.
What is the truth? Is there a danger that memory will play tricks? It makes you think about the difference between history and memory.
Archives provokes emotional responses, and they're able to challenge big narratives, like a national narrative that's been transformed, politicised, all the things you want, but family narratives as well.
We need those archives, not just in Ireland, but everywhere. And we need those archives in order to try and come to some approximation of an understanding of who we are.
We're joined by Nuala O'Connor, the director of Keepers of the Flame. It's currently on limited release in Irish cinemas, and from what I understand, it will be broadcast on RTE at some point.
That's right, Jonathan. We haven't got a date yet, but I think it will be sometime towards the end of spring, say April kind of time, end April.
Could you tell us what the documentary is about and why you were drawn to this subject?
My attention was drawn to the subject by Dermot Ferreter, the historian with whom I'd worked on a television series called The Limits of Liberty, and we finished that series in 2009, and it was about the story of it was the history of Ireland since the establishment of the Free State and the distribution of power and the centralisation of power in the state since independence. And Dermot drew my attention to the fact that there was this massive archive. It sounds very dry. There were pension applications from people, dependents, wounded people and families of participants in the War of Independence and later on in the Civil War. And it's a massive archive of 85,000 applications and a huge number of files. I think there was up to, 3 times that number of actual files. And so it's a first-hand account written in people's own words about what they did in those times, because they needed to give an account of their activities in order to be eligible for the pension. So many of them had never spoken about those events because they were very traumatic. And when the files were then, when this archive was opened up to historians sometime around 2010, it was the first time they had seen the light of day since the files had been established, since the pension legislation had been established in 1924. So it's a phenomenal, it's a unique archive, in fact. And then the move to digitise it, make it accessible online so anybody can literally look up anybody's file, it was a monumental undertaking, and it gives us a kind of a unique perspective on that generation of Irish people and their families who had lived through those times.
So there was around 85,000 who applied for the pensions.
That's right.
That. And how many of them were rewarded pensions for their service?
About 16,000. So the vast majority of them didn't get them. They didn't get the pensions, and the pensions were also very small. So they were small but important amounts of money, sometimes keeping people literally from destitution. So some people were hugely dependent on who got it on pension, and other people literally left the country or emigrated because they didn't get the pension. Other people wanted the pension for status reasons. So the pension was an acknowledgement, a state acknowledgement of their contribution to the War of Independence. So they were, the pension was the only thing, if you like, that confirmed or proved that they had done what they had said they had done.
Well, why were so many people left frustrated, though? Like, were the civil service trying to save money, or was it because
some of the veterans were involved in the Civil War then? And that was
partly, civil servants are always trying to save money. I mean, that's a universal law, I think, of civil servants in all times, in all places. and in all circumstances. There was another sort of feeling that, or an attitude, as espoused by the first Prime Minister in charge of the scheme, W.T. Cosgrave, who said there will be no soft pensions. This is not money. This is not kind of money that's going to keep you, even or sustain you. It's simply an acknowledgement. Now, in terms of the people who didn't get it, the verification procedures were incredibly rigid, so that you had to give a verifying account from your commanding officer, for example, that you were at the place you said you were, that this ambush or event or engagement or whatever took place, and that your commanding officer can verify it, and that there's at least a number of witnesses also in your company that can substantiate your claim. So you just imagine years after the event, particularly for the anti-treaty people who were only eligible to apply in the 30s, or the 40s rather, they were years away from, some of them 16, 17, 20 years even away from the events that they're describing. So two things can have happened. Their memory can be faulty at that stage, because who remembers with that degree of precision something that happened 20 years ago? And also, often the people who they needed to verify their accounts are dead. So that was definitely one issue with the system, that they couldn't always verify their service.
Another issue the documentary explored was discrimination on the basis of gender, how there were women who served in the struggle for independence weren't recognised by this scheme. Like what was going on there?
Oh, that was a strange aspect to the first slew of pensions. The first lot of pensions, the first pension legislation was enacted in 1924, and it gave pensions to only really one class of person, and that was pro-treaty men who had fought, i.e. held a gun or shot a gun or been engaged in military engagements in the War of Independence, in 1916, the War of Independence and the Civil War. Anti-treaty activists were excluded, as were women. Women were not deemed in that first legislation to be, they weren't deemed to be soldiers because they hadn't, so to speak, held a gun or fired a gun.
Even though they were doing dangerous things.
All armies in the world allow, for the purposes of pension, other grades like couriers, dispatch riders, medical orderlies. They're all regarded as combat personnel for the purpose of pension. So why they were excluded, I don't know. I know why the irregulars were excluded, because they were regarded basically as anti-free state, if you like, a threat to the state, subversive. But when De Valera's government was elected in 1932, the first thing he did was enact another stream of legislation which brought in women and made them eligible and recognised their work as it should have been, and then brought in the anti-treaty people of whom he had been, in fact, the leader of. So those two excluded participants were brought in the second lot of legislation, but it didn't really matter either the first lot or the second lot. The verification procedures were as difficult for both, under both streams of legislation. So the same percentage of failed applications probably applies to the second legislation, even more so because of the time lapse involved.
Well, De Valera's record on women's rights is a long conversation, but in terms of the documentary, you did find interviews with people like Mankin Magon, Lisa Mulcahy, people who were descendants or relatives of these veterans. So, how did you go about finding these interviews? Because they really make the story hit home in terms of their knock-on effect and modern relevance.
Yeah, well, because there were two things that struck me. One was that the pension files lasted for the life of the person who got the pension. So some of the files they close when the person dies, and these people were still dying at the end of the 20th century. So they're very, very long files. And that was number one. And so you could follow not just their lives, but the lives of their families, their children, and also we wanted, if you like, now you picked at Lisa Mulcahy there, her grandfather and her grandmother were both involved, and they were high profile activists. And well known. Her grandfather was a minister in the Commonwealth government, and the commander in chief of the army in the War of Independence after Collins was executed or assassinated. So, but they're really not representative, I think, of the general run of people in the film. We wanted it to be about ordinary people. So I found the grandson of, for instance, Mrs. Elizabeth Traynor. She was left with 10 children. Her husband wasn't a high-profile person. He just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and be one of the last people to be executed by the British just on the eve of the truce and the treaty. And she had a terrible life in terms of a financially constrained life after her husband was executed, and had a miserable pension. And so I found her grandson, who remembered his grandmother very, very well and had lived with her for a while, and acknowledged the burden that she carried because her husband was executed. And they were the kind of things I was interested in, that the impact in terms of trauma on the family, after all these quite ordinary people had left their regular civilian lives, taken part in this cataclysmic series of wars, ending in a civil war. And some of them had gone back into civilian life afterwards, and said nothing about what they had done. So the first time their families knew anything about the kind of nitty-gritty of what their engagement and activities were was when they looked in their pension files. So I basically set about trying to find them a combination of ways. I went to the 1916 Relatives organisation and put a call out there for anybody who had a relative who'd applied for a pension or received a pension, and I got some results from that. I knew Lisa Mulcahy, actually, because she's a filmmaker, and I had worked with her in the past, and I knew her past. I knew about her. So that was an easy one for me. I knew there was an interesting story there, and I was lucky enough to know her. And then we called the film Keepers of the Flame, because all these people keep the memory of their relatives alive in some way. They acknowledge what they did. They're interested in their lives. They do a lot of, some of them are writers, some of them are filmmakers, like Moncon McGann, for example, the grandson of Sheila Humphreys, a very high-profile Republican all her life. So, and I knew Moncon, and I knew that he was he had made a film about his grandmother with his brother Ruan. So those kind of people interested me.
Well, I think it's definitely a strength of the documentary that the veterans discussed are a mix of household names and people who are overlooked. But like one of the interviews you had was a big name. It was President Michael D. Higgins. How does one secure an interview with him, and what did his contributions bring to the documentary?
Well, we knew that the president had a father and a brother who were on opposite sides in the Civil War, and that the brother, his uncle, his father's brother, the president's uncle, had applied for and successfully got a pension under the 1924 legislation, because he had been in the so-called National Army. We also knew that his father, Michael D. Higgins' father, had applied unsuccessfully for a pension initially, and then towards the end of his shortish life, I mean, he died in his late 50s or early 60s in very miserable circumstances, very ill, very broken. He'd been in a regular. That was the other thing about that. A lot of those activists was that their health was completely broken down after the Civil War, because they had spent so much time out of doors and literally at night and in wet clothes and in ditches, and they had been shot, they'd been interned, they'd been poorly nourished. So a lot of them did not live very long lives. Ernie O'Malley's father was dead at 57, and that was a kind of a pattern you get often with people who'd been involved also in the Civil War. Anyway, I knew the president had written a very well-known poem called The Betrayal, which I knew about, and so I just and I knew there were 2 pension applications there. I looked them up. I wrote to him through his secretariat in the Áras, and he was interested. It's a topic that interests him, and he's very interested in the commemoration side of things, how we remember, how we commemorate, because clearly you cannot celebrate a civil war in the same way that you can, say, celebrate a war of independence. And so the commemoration of the Civil War is coming up, and he was interested in tackling that. And so I knew it would be an interesting interview, and we were lucky. He granted it to us.
I mean, that is something else the documentary explores quite well towards the end, is how commemorations are affected by the politics of the day when they're being held. So, I mean, could you talk a bit about like that and how you think the Civil War commemorations, for example, and the centenary of independence, and there's all this kind of stuff coming up, and like how you think they might be affected?
That's a really, really interesting question, and I think the state, according to Dermot, I think the state is proposing to do just a day's remembrance. So we have a kind of a remembrance day for everybody. And then that local, I think the one thing that the 2016 commemoration really brought to light was the appetite that people have for history, as in the story of their own place, their own families. And that there was a huge amount of activity around the local story and the family story and the personal story in Ireland during 2016. And now how that will play out in terms of the Civil War, I don't know. And you're right, the political situation affects the way we commemorate. When the Troubles were running in the north of Ireland, the commemoration / celebration of 1916, the public side of that, the march down O'Connell Street, the Guard of Honour, the presidential salute, all of that all went by the wayside because it was regarded as, too volatile, too sensitive. And then it was reintroduced, I think, at the 75th anniversary in 91, 92. So I think that was when Mary Robinson was president, and she was the first president then since the Troubles started to take the salute and have the Guard of Honour. So we're entering Brexit now again. So will there be a hard border? Will there crash out? Who knows what the next bunch of circumstances are going to throw up. And one thing, though, I think does stand as a commemoration is the archive itself, because there you have the accounts of the people written, the letters to the pension boards in their own hand, talking about themselves, their lives, their experiences, their attitudes, their hopes and aspirations for the country. And it's all in there in that archive, and that is a kind of a memorial, a living memorial, if you like, accessible to the entire country. So that's something that wasn't there before. And even though it's not intended to be any kind of a commemoration or memorial, I think it will be, and the perspective of 100 years will help, I think. I hope it will. Even though 100 years in Irish memory is not that long, really.
It's definitely an important issue to make a documentary about. I just wanted to finish up on 2 technical questions. Like one is about how does one go about writing a documentary? Is it about structuring the flow of the story, or how do you sort of get a shape and structure on a topic like this that affects thousands of people and 100 years of history?
I think that Dermot is a very much bottom-up historian and has always worked with archive and memoir and biography, autobiography, and the accounts of institutional accounts of events and so on. And so you build up a picture of the experience of those times. And I think we were very, very much interested in that look at, so that there's no voice of God, as we call it, saying this happened then, other than just to say the pension scheme happened then and was established at such and such a time. But there's very little interview with talking heads or with experts. So we took that view, and also that the pension file, Dermot very much had the notion and the sense of it, that it was a chronicle of disappointment in one way, because all these people didn't get it, and buried in that disappointment is a disappointment in the Republic itself. What had they fought for? Why were they being treated like this? What did it now say about the new state? And those questions are very interesting, and we wanted to tease those out. So they were the overarching themes. And the other big one you've already mentioned is, how do we remember? And how it's so contingent on contemporary circumstances, and to bring that point home so that, we're not out of the woods yet with this one. It's still going on, and this film is only the way it is, the year we filmed it, if you like.
So when you're finalising the structure of the film, how do you find the visual language of the film? Because it struck me that early on there's a lot of quite abstract imagery of nature, and then towards the end archive footage comes into it more. So could you talk a bit about how you match visuals to the words that are being spoken? And
that was the most challenging aspect of it for me, I think, because it's about memory and remembering. As you know yourself, it's an internal, aside from state commemoration, which is the public remembering, but people's private or personal remembering is a mood thing, and it's often evoked by the places where the events happened. So I was very lucky. For instance, I found Sean Tracy's mother's house. Nobody knew it was there really until people started going looking for it, and I was able to film there, and it perfectly matched the mood of the file of Mrs. Tracy, which was melancholy, which was disappointed, which was grief-stricken. She was a widow with only one child. That child was her son Sean Tracy. He was killed in an ambush in Talbot Street. So some of those scenes in Dublin were the actual house that the letter was written from, the first application, and the address that the person lived at. And I kind of worked up from there and tried to create a mood. And then the other thing I did was I used the letters themselves, because I was very keen to bring out the voices of the letter writers. And so that was pure mood, and the archive itself, because the letters and the handwriting were, to me, very beautiful objects to look at in themselves, because so few people really spend any amount of time writing letters nowadays. And these people wrote letters of 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 pages long in handwriting that they had learned in school, often very beautiful handwriting, often in ink and pen, So I wanted to feature that, and I wanted to Colm Macanumra, who did the music soundtrack for it, I think he was very sympathetic to that mood and atmosphere, and I think he did a lot of work to bring that out in the moodiness of it. So that's really, I kind of felt my way through that, I suppose.
Well, it all results in a strong cinematic sensibility for important topics. So we appreciate you talking to Film Ireland. Thank you for joining us, Nuala O'Connor.
Thank you very much for asking me, Jonathan. Thank you.